it's I'm having a whole problem where where the problem for some reason is the mouse isn't connecting, which is why that invite didn't work, because it was like it all automatically restarted my computer to upload the driver, or to load the driver. And it was like, wait, no, don't. Done. Yeah. So I was like, okay, hey, sorry, I'm having some issues. Anyway, how's it been, man? I haven't talked to you in it seems like a long time. I haven't not in any
well,
meaningful way.
well, I am I'm lounging in Ellicott City right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Um, it is I'm visiting my Ellicott City parents for the holidays. Oh, I like that. What is that?
It's Sweetwater 420 strain. This is G13, very dank hemp based IPA, as they describe it, an aromatic super hybrid sticky IPA.
Ooh,
It's ready to drink, and I find that the first few sips, I feel like I'm just basically eating a fat bud, um,
well,
and then
this
it's
here,
delicious after that. That is,
this
in
is my
fact, a fat.
Friday.
That is a fat
that
bud.
is in that is in fact in the vapor form, mind
Mm-hmm.
you, because like I said, I met my parents,
Yeah.
so can't stink the place up with bud.
Sure. So, are you there
So
just for the day? Are you there for
no,
the?
no,
Are
I've
you
been
off for the
here
holiday?
for. I am here for the holiday.
Okay.
I'm in between places right now. My
Interesting.
old lease
Well, I
ended.
knew you said that, but I thought you were going to stay.
I was gonna stay, but the place the rate was just atrocious.
The rent went up.
It was, believe it or not, $2,600 a month.
No, I believe it. I'm telling you, man, it is. One of these days you're going to figure out that all the things that I'm saying are real and true, and that you are supporting the people that support the immiseration.
So
That's all I'm
so
saying.
it
That's all I'm
didn't make
saying.
much sense to do that again. So I am looking right now for my next landing spot, and so I'm crashing here.
Sure. Yeah, no,
It
that's an
is.
insane. It's an insane amount
Yes,
of money.
it's
Yeah,
awesome.
well, that's great. I'm glad you
It's
have that.
very, very
I'm
convenient.
glad you have the
Believe
option.
me, very convenient.
If things ever get real grim, we've got a spare room, and you are. I am as a big proponent of mutual aid. I'm happy to have you. I'm happy to help out in any way that I can.
I like how you said
That
if
is
things get that grim.
fire, because it would require a significant impact on your life. You'd
uh,
have to relocate.
well, I'll be honest. I had a really legitimate offer to go up to Saratoga and stay there. I've also got another one to go down to Fort Lauderdale.
Saratoga, as in like Saratoga Springs or Saratoga,
Correct.
Florida.
Saratoga Springs, New
Okay.
York. And then the other one
Yeah.
was in
Okay.
Lauderdale, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And which are great offers, and as well as yours, which you just offered, which are wonderful offers. The problem is, I would have to constantly come back because of my daughter.
Sure. Of course. Of
You
course.
know what I mean?
And you said Saratoga, by the way, and I said Saratoga, Florida, thinking that the word that I was saying was Sarasota, Florida, because
Sarasota. That's Sarasota.
yeah.
Yes,
I was like,
correct.
after I said that, I
Sarasota.
was like, wait a second, there's a Saratoga Springs. I knew that was my
Saratoga Springs,
first
which
thought, and
which is
then
a lovely
yeah,
town, by the way. If you have never been there,
yeah,
it's a
it's
great, great town. Really good town.
at the FDR the vacation White House or whatever in that Saratoga Springs.
It might be. I'm not sure.
I can't remember.
I
I feel
know
like
it.
I know FDR had a place down here in the South somewhere that was called the Little White House, maybe in Missouri or I don't know, somewhere in the deep South where he died.
Okay,
In like Hot Springs, Arkansas, or something. I think it actually might have been Hot Springs, Arkansas,
gotcha.
where his brain exploded.
Ooh,
Um,
nice.
yeah, it's good stuff. They're like this medicine. He had a terrible doctor. Like his when he died, like they had checked, like he had health problems, and they like checked his blood pressure. And they're like, oh, it's like 500 over 300. Go take a dip in the water. That should do it. And it was like, no, dude, like that guy needs like medical care. And his head explode because and his head, he had a massive stroke and died. Like, of course he did. Like his blood pressure was it was insane. I think when anyway, but I think it was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had gone because he wasn't feeling well, but his doctor was completely incompetent, but also it was the early 40s and a lot of doctors were incompetent. So, it's one of those,
Yes.
Like FDR, if he were president today, would not have died in the middle of his fourth term or in the beginning of his fourth. He would have survived that because, doctors just were like still somewhere, like
sure.
back then they were just somewhere still between like alchemy and science. They hadn't quite settled on one or the other. They were basically they were still trying to turn lead into gold while also treating illness. It was like a hot mess.
Correct. Ooh, that reminds
lead
me.
into gold. That's your life's work.
Exactly.
Completely unbalanced.
Come on now, Brian.
That's pretty awful.
Oh my God.
He's unbalanced.
This guy is a lunatic.
These men lived in a much different time. God, we got some kooky people back in this time.
It's not obvious that we are professionals. You're not paying attention. We know what we're doing.
But I'm serious.
Can we start already?
That's Biden is not, look at his record. He's not the left. I mean, he's the right. I mean, he's the right. He's the crime bill and like he voted for Iraq. I mean, he's the right wing guy.
Yes.
Anyway.
Tricked into
and your boy, the truth is starting to come out about your boy DeSantis now about what he was doing in the military before his military career. He's always kept. Have you seen it? Have you seen any of this?
Here we go. The what do you mean? Like
Torture?
This is I know it was predicted that we would have some sort of attack.
Yeah, it's not an attack. It's he's for a guy who has a military record, he's never really talked about it. And in fact, like doesn't answer any questions and everything else. It's always been a little bit suspicious, especially as a Republican, to not like run on your veteran status. It's very unusual. As you well know, that's a thing that Republican, Democrat alike try to do. If they're a veteran, they use that as a selling point to voters. And he never really has. And he was a JAG lawyer, but his job as a JAG lawyer was to go down to Guantanamo to make sure that the enemy combatants, as they call them, were being treated humanely and in accordance with international law. Problem is, he was there during the worst part of the torture regiment. That during the time that we were engaged in like the Abu Ghraib torture type stuff and waterboarding at Guantanamo and all that. And he was the lawyer that was there to make sure that those people were being treated well in accordance with law. And he, as an abject failure, and in fact, it's now come out that like prisoners who ended up released were like, yeah, he came in like he was going to be our friend.
He came in and whipped us.
No, he came in like he was our friend, and we complained about like the violations of international law. People who were jailed for years and then released because they were innocent, have come forward and be like, no, we talked to him thinking because he came in like, hey, I'm here to make sure you're going to be treated humanely, and we told him the things that, and we told him the things that they were doing that were in violation of international law. And we told him the things that were really, the worst things. And he went and told the CIA those things. These are the things that are bothering them the most, so they could ramp up those things. So he was supposed to be there as a protection to make sure that we were in compliance with the Nuremberg statutes and things like that against war crimes. And he, in fact, told them, hey, don't worry about it. These are the things that are it's bad. Anyway,
well, that's
DeSantis
terrible.
He's a ghoul. I mean, I've always said he's a ghoul because I live here, but
he's a great man.
Matter.
He's a great man, a great leader.
Sure. And, anybody that makes it easier to torture people is a good guy that deserves your vote.
No proof that happened.
I mean, only the people who say it. I mean, only the people who were there who
If he's
witnessed
an
it.
attorney, if he's an attorney down there, I'm sure he tried to do his best, but unfortunately, he probably didn't have
I mean, there's
the
some
ability
firsthand
to do what he wanted to do. I'm sure
firsthand
it hurts him
accounts
to
about
this
him
day.
watching them being tortured and laughing about it. So that's pretty cool too.
Oh yeah, that sounds
Um,
true.
That does.
That sounds very viable.
I mean, it's only the eyewitnesses, but it's
Come
only
on.
You're right. It's only eyewitnesses. They probably aren't telling the truth. People who were like, hey, when we were down there, like we had nothing to fight back with, but there were things that we did in order to try and in order to fight back. We would do things like you'd throw feces on people if they were like only the worst people you'd throw your feces on, and you'd spit on them or you'd do whatever, but only the worst people got feces. And they were like, we threw feces at that guy, DeSantis. That guy was the worst. He lied to us. He betrayed us, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Do not buy into a lot of the articles that I'm just going to warn you ahead of time.
This isn't articles. These are these are literal people who were like one of the guys that was talking was picked up when he was 15 years old and sent to Guantanamo. He was completely innocent. They kept him there for 12 years, never found anything. And he was a child when they arrested him, was tortured. And he was one of the people who's come out and been like, and now has been released. He's like, all those years, I was tortured for years, all this stuff. He's like, and DeSantis is one of the 3 or 4 worst people that we dealt with because he came in like a friend and then took everything we said and used it against us and made it worse and laughed and stood there and laughed at us while we were tortured. And he's like, so he was one of the few people that we actually threw feces at. So again, I
will vote for him.
I know you will.
For sure.
It doesn't matter. Trump's going to win the.
For sure.
Trump's going to win the nomination, and
never.
Mm-hmm.
Never. I promise.
He'll win the nomination, or he'll run as an independent. He'll do one of those 2 things.
That may be so.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, that's probably his best shot. Although
he'll torpedo Republicans if they turn on him. He will.
That would be interesting.
I mean, he does
very, very.
He doesn't care. He's no more of a Republican than anything. He's anyway, whatever. Anyway, Mike, welcome to a very special edition of Unbalanced Views. It is our Christmas edition, and I thought in the spirit of Christmas, regardless of what you celebrate out there, in the spirit of Christmas, I thought we'd do a little deep dive into the American version of Christmas. Although we are going to go all through a lot of stuff before we get to that. But we're going to talk about the American traditions surrounding Christmas, how we got there, where they come from, all this stuff. Yes. We're going to dig into Christmas in what I hope will be fun.
Saint Nick. We're going to find the real Saint Nick. We're going to uncover the origins, where he's from, where did he go to school, what was his interest,
where did he go to school?
Who did he date before Mrs. Klaus?
Mm-hmm.
All of this interesting stuff we're going to uncover tonight. I'm so interested. I want to know about Mrs. Klaus. I want to know about little Junior Klaus. I want to know about who's going to take over when Mr. Klaus finally dies. Like, is there the little Klaus coming up? Sure. And how old is Mr. Klaus right now?
Okay, interesting.
I want to know all this. I got a bunch of questions.
Okay.
So I'm very curious.
Okay, so we will discuss things like the origins of Kris Kringle, and we're going to talk about Belsnickel, and we're going to talk about Krampus.
Yes. And I don't know Belsnickel.
Okay, well you should. You live in Maryland. You definitely should. But we're gonna go. We got to start all the way back in the very, very beginning,
when Jesus was born, which is the real reason for Christmas.
Way before Jesus was born. So,
don't tell me Saint Nick is older than Jesus.
No, but we got to go back. Saint Nick comes later. We're going to go. Okay. As we are setting about, decking our halls and firing up our Yule logs and hanging our stockings, committing a veritable genocide of Fraser firs. We're gonna dig into where all this stuff comes from. So the overarching question is, why do we celebrate Christmas? Why do we celebrate Christmas the way we celebrate Christmas? Why is it December 23rd?
Right, baby.
All that stuff. So not surprisingly, partly because you're listening to this podcast, the Unbalanced Views of History podcast, we're going to go back all the way back to like the beginning of human civilization because, I can't help myself. Ooh. So a lot of our current traditions actually kind of grow out of like traditions from the very beginning of human civilization. So We are going to go way back, all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. The very
I love it.
first human civilizations. And you understand, right? Like human beings existed before this. Civilization is like is by definition is like when people come together and start living in societies, right? In like an urban environment, so for lack of better terms. People had existed in sort of tribal nomadic communities, even tribal communities that maybe weren't nomadic, but they hadn't like sat still really in order to survive. They had to follow their food sources to some degree, all the way up until sort of ancient Mesopotamia. And we date that usually somewhere around 4000 BCE, before Common Era. We call that is somewhere in that range. People started settling in the Mesopotamian area. And Mesopotamia is a word means between the two rivers. So this is between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In modern day kind of Iraq primarily, it's where Babylon will eventually grow up. But like this is where we're talking about.
Correct.
Like in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates River, in what they call the Fertile Crescent, right? You got these two rivers, they flood, so they just dump all this like super rich soil, right? So it's the perfect place for agriculture. And once you have agriculture, now agriculture started about 10,000 years ago. Once you are able to grow your own food, you start opening the possibility that you might not have to chase your own food, right? So agriculture 10,000 years ago, allows people to start having semi-permanent settlements. Like people would kind of grow food through the growing season and then migrate with the herds. And by herds, I don't mean domesticated animals. I mean like following the mammoth or whatever. But like Mesopotamia is the first time that we have agricultural development to the point where people are able to grow enough food that they can survive through kind of the winters and things like that. When there is no growing season or it's a short growing season, you can't grow very much. They're able to survive these eras, right? Like in the same place without having to chase animals. They've also developed some herding and they have some domesticated animals, things like that. So as a result of people being able to sit still, you're able to start having a kind of hierarchical leadership system develop whereby you can specialize, right? So you get people who are artisans who can, if you don't have to chase your food all the time, people are able to start like figuring out things like, how do you make bricks? How do you make shelter? How do you make structures? How can you organize, a society to engage in the amount of labor that needs to be done to make the society survive and all that stuff. Okay. So the reason I say all that is that before civilization, we have no records, really written records of any kind, really, what people are doing. We do have some like cave paintings and things like that. So we have a sense of the things that were important to humans, but we don't really have the context. In Mesopotamia, particularly the Sumerians, they're the first people that developed writing. It's called cuneiform. So we actually start to get some like records, and it's actually kind of wild. This is all off topic, but cuneiform is kind of wild. That it starts as this system where they like. So there's a lot of speculation about how writing starts, but the theory that I think is the most logical and makes sense to me is that we have evidence of these things that were like basically clay like envelopes that people used to use as a kind of way of record keeping. So you would have this envelope, and inside of the envelope would be, for lack of better terms, like little totems or like little representations of financial transactions. So you would trade, however many, bales of hay for however many barrels of oil or whatever, right? And they would have these kind of little clay, little figures that that you could make with your hands, and you'd seal them in the envelope, and it was essentially served as a receipt. So then it was sealed in clay, and the whole thing would be, sort of hardened. And so then, you could sort of break this open if you needed to prove your, like what you had or whatever. And the way, so they start doing this. And then over time, people start marking the outside of these envelopes with like little wedge shaped marks to demonstrate, to show what's inside the envelope. Right. So you'd have like a series of these kind of like wedges cut into the wet clay, and then it's hardened. So then you could actually see sort of your receipt on the outside of this envelope, even though you still had the figures inside to like verify what was on the outside. And eventually people were like, hey, this is silly.
Right.
We don't need the inside part because we've got the outside part. This tells us everything we transacted. And so they keep making the envelopes, but then they're hollow, but they have the marks on the outside. And eventually those clay tablets get flattened. They're like, well, this is silly. Why are we making them hollow? And they just start making them flat. And so we have archaeological evidence of that kind of progression. And that's really the introduction of writing, is these like marks on the outside of these transactional, so anyway, so this is like the early evidence of like civilization coming together. I'm going to shut up about all that and just go to the Christmas part. So not surprisingly, ancient peoples were particularly interested in things like the movement of the planets, the movement of the stars, in order to mark out the passage of time, because these things really matter when you are primarily like a sedentary agricultural society. You need to know when to plant. You need to know when to harvest. You know what I mean? You need to know these things. And
Correct.
as you well know, weather is not always a good indicator of when it's spring or when it's fall, because like you can get a nice warm snap in February and then it freezes the first week of March or whatever. And so if you planted during that warm snap in February, you'd lose. Right. So they mark out these things in order to mark time. And, we end up with calendars and things, whatever. But because of the significance of these, the movement of these celestial bodies into the everyday lives of people, one of the most important holidays that sort of develops for early civilizations will be the celebrating the solstice, both in winter and summer. But we're only obviously dealing with the winter solstice. Now, you're familiar with the solstice.
Yes, it's a Pontiac Solstice. It was a car made probably between the years of 2013 and 18.
Yeah, probably. That sounds right. So the solstice, is, from the root of that is soul, right? The soul, as in the sun, the name of our sun. The solstice is represents in winter the shortest day of the year, and in summer the longest day of the year.
Right.
Okay. So they are the two times where the sun is tilted far, appears in the sky for the shortest amount of time, and obviously in the summer the longest amount of time. They mark the turning points in the year, right? Likewise, people cared a lot about the equinoxes, which were in the fall and the spring, the 2 days where the sun and where day and night were equal in the sky. Sun and moon were equal in the sky. So solstice matters because, again, the winter solstice means it's the shortest day of the year, which means every day after that, the days will start getting longer. It means you've crossed over winter and you're heading now towards spring, even though we recognize like the solstice happens in December. So like it's the very beginning of winter, but it's like the year is over and the new year is beginning, right? For ancient people, usually the solstice a lot of times represents like the kind of end of the year. All right. So anyway, this tradition of celebrating the solstice obviously goes back farther than even the Sumerians. And the Sumerians were like a loose collection of like city-states, for lack of better terms, in southern Mesopotamia, sort of near the Persian Gulf, like I said, between Tigris and Euphrates. The principal city was a city called Uruk, U-R-U-K, Uruk, which is probably where the name Iraq derives.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So the city of Uruk, Iraq. Now there are some other theories about that, but that's beyond our issue here today. Sumerians, like I said, they invented writing as we would recognize it, cuneiform, around 3400 BCE. So about 1400 years before the very first complex kind of European civilizations emerged on the island of Crete. So, pretty early on, right? 1,400 years before Europe, the Sumerians were writing, and 1,400 years later, the very first civilizations emerge in Europe. All right. So, and again, if you sort of know your geography, the Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, is not that far from Greece. The Mediterranean serves as once you have figure out how to sail and whatnot, the Mediterranean serves as a highway more than a barrier. But 3,400 BCE, the Mediterranean is still pretty treacherous. Okay. So the solstice celebration in Mesopotamia among the Sumerians, but other groups, and we sort of lump all these groups together as Sumerians because they have a kind of relatively shared culture, even though they're not like a nation. They're like I said, a loose confederation of nation states. They battle against each other. They work together. They do, but like they are roughly the same kind of cultural, they come from the same cultural background, Sumerians. They celebrated something called Zagmuk, which was a celebration of their sun god, a guy named Marduk. And again, this sort of, if you think about the city named Uruk, Marduk, Zagmuk, Uruk. Uk is a pretty important name. The UK is obviously something that pops up a lot. Okay. Zagmuk is basically the New Year celebration. And the Aryans celebrated a 12-day long festival in December centered around the solstice, right, to celebrate the new year. So he celebrated 12 days.
Okay.
Now, in the Christian tradition,
Did they have their own Adam Sandler that made a song about this? Do you know of back then?
That was 8 days, I think.
12 days of solstice.
Yeah, the 8 crazy nights. Is that what you're thinking?
The 8 crazy nights.
Yeah,
is that what
you're
it
thinking
is?
of? You're thinking of his Hanukkah song. Yeah, 8 crazy nights.
That's it. That's it.
No, this is 12 days. But I'm just going to pose this question because 12 is a really important number in basically every ancient civilization up to modern civilizations. It's the number of apostles, right? It's the number of tribes of Israel. But have you ever thought about why 12 is such an important number?
12. Let me think about this. I've heard something about this, but for some reason it's not jumping off at me. I can't think of what it is. I know there's a significance to it.
Sure.
Kind of like the baker's dozen type thing.
Well, sure.
But I can't put it all together.
I mean, because, on some level, it's really easy to understand why 5 is an important number for humans, why 10 is an important number, and even why 20 is an important number, because it's the number of fingers and toes that we have. So, it's pretty easy to understand why 10s are important because you can count them very easily.
Yes.
Or 5s.
Yes, at birth you're counting.
Yeah, so it's obvious why those, basically everything 1 through 10, it makes sense why we have a base 10 numbering system, right, and all that.
Correct.
12, however, you might recognize as the number of months that we have. And the reason that we have 12 months, the word month comes from the word moon. So it's how many cycles of the moon we have in a year. So these ancient people,
12.
They understood that the year was 12 cycles of the moon. Now, obviously the lunar year is a little bit shorter than the solar year, which is, it doesn't really, which is why, Chinese New Year is they use the Lunar New Year and all this stuff. Their New Year changes every year, what day it's going to be on and all that. Yep. And ancient people tried to make adjustments to their own calendars in a variety of ways. Because, go ahead.
I believe it's the beginning of February, if I'm not mistaken.
But it varies because
around the beginning of February.
It varies because each year you lose. It's just like the 365-day year isn't quite accurate. We go around the sun in 365 and 1/4 of a day, which is why every 4th day we have an extra day just to make the calendar balance. Because, over a handful of years, that wouldn't make much difference. But over centuries, that losing a day every 4 years would screw your calendar all up after a couple hundred years. You know what I mean? So if you're trying to track time over 2,000 years, every 4th year you lose a day. After 2,000 years, you'd be celebrating Christmas in July. You know what I mean? Things would be all out of whack. So
exactly.
So ancient people found a variety of ways to deal with this. A lot of times they would do things they understood this too. They understood that the Lunar New Year that tracking the lunar cycle, which is a roughly 30-day cycle, didn't quite match up with the actual year. So a lot of times, different cultures, they would do different things. Some of them would have a 5-day celebration at the end, or a 5-day period that didn't fall into the calendar at the end of the year in order to make up the time. And so there's a variety of innovative solutions. But what's interesting though about that 12 days is it's really significant because that's how many lunar cycles there are in a year. So it's perfectly reasonable. It's why we have there's 12 astrology signs. You can look up and see different constellations. There are 12 constellation kind of alignments that occur during the course of the year, which is where all the zodiac signs come from. The 12 zodiacs come from the constellation. So if you're not tracking just the moon and you're looking at the stars, which again in a pre-technological society, this is what you have. You have stars and moon, and so you figure all this stuff out, right? So anyway, this 12-day celebration of Zagmuk, centered around the solstice, the shortest day, and the celebration was about how Marduk, who was called the calf of the sun, or basically the son of this, the child of the son of the sun, and the sun was a god. So the son of God went into the underworld, and he battled chaos, who was embodied as like a monster of sorts. He had to battle chaos for 12 days. During the course of that 12 days, Marduk died, right? That would be the solstice. That was the death of Marduk, was the solstice. You could tell because the sun died because it was the shortest day. But after that, Marduk was able to eventually sort of resurrect and defeat chaos and come back to life and emerge after this 12 days. So you can find a lot of elements in something called the Enuma Elish, which is the ancient Mesopotamian creation myth, which is older than, say, the Genesis story, for example, by a significant margin, but contains similar stories, contains a flood narrative, which, again, considering that these people live between two rivers, makes a lot of sense. You're living in floodplains between two rivers.
Yes, I've heard the flood narrative quite a bit. I think that's a very common narrative.
It's
right?
A common narrative for people who society. I mean, most ancient societies settle along riverbanks because that's where fresh water is. So, yes, it is pretty common for people who settle along rivers because rivers flood, and so to have some sort of flood myth makes a lot of sense. Most of them are. I mean, they're all very. There are similarities, but they're all different. Anyway, so this stuff with Zagmuk there's a lot of variation based on in different regions, but primarily the story goes kind of Marduk defeats chaos, and you could tell that Marduk has won his battle because the days start getting longer as he gains strength after his victory. All right, there was one variation in Babylon, actually, years later. Babylon's like 2,400 years later from where we start this story. But Babylon, where the king of Babylon actually, they reenacted a play, and the kings of Babylon would play the role of Marduk, and they would act out the battle in court, and he would be he would be freed from the underworld on the 10th day of this 12th day celebration, and he would perform something called the Hyros Gamos, which was a ritualized intercourse with a high priestess, who was sort of was in the play, would play his wife. So he would have the king would have to have this public intercourse with this priestess who came from as a priestess of the Naditum, which basically was this class that was sworn not really to celibacy, but they had a refusal to bear any children. But he would have to have this ritual sex in front of the whole court in order to reenact the rebirth of Marduk. And this would restore the cosmic balance. And then on the 12th day, the king would be killed so that he could then go into the cosmic realm to battle alongside Marduk for the year to make sure that people had a good and plentiful year. As you can imagine, pretty quickly during the course of this ritual, the king said, hey, I got an idea. Let's appoint a fake king for 12 days, a guy who can have all the authority of the king for just these 12 days until he's killed, and then I'll take over again. And so that's what they would do. They'd usually find a serious criminal that was going to be executed. They're like, guess what, buddy? Congratulations. You get to be the king, and you get to have this ritualized intercourse with this priestess. But you will be killed after 12 days so you can go battle with Zagmuk. But the promise, of course, was, nice. But you'll be forgiven for all your sins because you've fought the good fight and all this. So anyway.
Well, that's a good trade-off. I like that.
Yeah. Okay. The rationale behind all this was that Marduk then fashioned the earth from Chaos's corpse, but the life kind of that he created from Chaos's corpse would kind of run out of energy. It would sort of run down each year. When the leaves started to fall and the days would get shorter, this was the sign that the earth needed to be reborn again. So Marduk would every year then have to travel to the underworld, battle a new chaos every year, and make the world whole by refashioning the world out of Chaos's corpse. Was the savior for humanity, who had to die, be resurrected, and recreate the earth in order to save humanity every year. Okay. Just, you can keep that in the back of your mind. This is as old as civilization goes, is this idea of resurrection, rebirth, and saving humanity. Sumerians would celebrate Zagmuk with bonfires. They would have these elaborate feasts, ritual kind of feasts, and music and dancing. They would exchange gifts. They'd sing songs of praise to Marduk, of course, who delivered the people from their death. Okay. Are you looking at your PowerPoint, by the way?
Not yet. You want me to?
You were supposed to start with me. So I've got some pictures of Marduk, some like ancient like engravings and stuff that we have, so you can kind of see this dude as he was represented. So pull it up. Can you do that, or are you using your phone? Yeah, because I want you to see this stuff. Because first off, I want you to see this stuff because I put a lot of time into it just for you. I put together.
So sweet.
I put together, because I know I'm going to talk a lot, and I wanted to give you something to keep you. I wanted to give you some pictures so that you could be engaged with pictures.
Shibidibidoo-da.
So we're going to go to ancient Egypt next. So take a peek and tell me when you get to Egypt, and then I'll start talking again.
Okie dokie, gonna do it again. You know it, baby.
It's remarkable how all these stories kind of carry over from culture to culture.
Gonna agree with it. Shibidibidoo-da.
See, I try to look out for you. Send it early. It's nice and set up. What can I do, man? I can only do so much.
But this is moving quicker than my phone.
I am but one man.
I hope so.
A hell of a man, but still just one man.
A very above average man.
Indeed. I don't
right, here we
I don't
go.
buy into the alpha beta whatever tropes. I think they're silly, and frankly, I think it's all loser shit. But I'm still a hell of a man.
I'm a very manly man.
Yeah, I mean,
we need more of us.
There is definitely a crisis of masculinity. There's no question about it. But yeah, I mean, I think that the problem is material, not. I mean, the problem is psychological, but I think the cause of that psychological trauma is material conditions leading to the psychic trauma. But that's just me. I think it's a pretty hard situation when you reveal that there's no hope, that there's no real promise, and no real solutions, and institutions are that you're supposed to rely on are collapsing and failing in front of your eyes all around you. It causes a crisis of faith, to be sure.
It does, but that same thing was happening in the 50s and
No,
60s.
it was not.
But, just watch Forrest Gump.
Oh yes, the historical documentary Forrest Gump. No, it was not happening.
Very accurate.
It did really. It started out. It really did start in the 70s. But it's it got so ramped up under Reagan and under Clinton. I mean, NAFTA is probably the greatest betrayal to working people in this country that there's been since Taft-Hartley. And but Reagan breaking the air traffic controller strike and things like that, just absolutely just devastated the ability of people to be able to rely on a working class kind of existence. So yeah. Anyway, neoliberalism. I listened to this one podcast, and I just love every time they start talking about neoliberalism, they clip in this little musical clip that just goes, say it loud, say it free. Yo, fuck Milton Friedman. I mean, that's really the bottom line is Milton Friedman is the body count on that dude is it's pretty high. His ideas have caused just tremendous suffering in this world.
Nice.
All right, are you there? Where are you?
Well, I'm opening it up right now. It looks like it's done downloading finally.
Okay.
All million pages of this thing. Let's see, baby.
It's a mere 80-page slideshow.
Here we go. Christmas images. Where are you? A history of Christmas. I like it. The sun gods.
There you go. Yeah, I put little subtitles.
Marduk. There's Marduk.
I put little subtitles in so that if you click along and if you just push play on the slideshow, you can just let it play, or just hit play and then click slide to slide. And when you get to you'll get to like a subtitle slide, then just wait until I'm talking about that thing. If I'm talking about it, then you click to the next one. So I put subtitle slides.
Here we go.
There you go.
Marduk.
All right,
I'm at Marduk.
So you see my dude. There's some engravings of my dude with his righteous beard
and his dog,
which
looks like a little Doberman pinscher.
All right,
with a muzzle.
Okay, I don't have images of him. I have things saved for you that are not. I don't have them, so I don't know what you're looking at.
You don't have?
I have a lot of them coming forward, but I didn't. I put Marduk on there just for you.
Okay. I mean, I like his getup. I like his hat. I like his dog. It looks like he's got some sort of he's wearing some sort of a royal gear getup going on with some overalls. He's gripping what looks like maybe, I can't tell what that is. If it's a weapon,
probably a sword.
Sword.
Yeah, either a sword or it could be like a staff of wheat, because again the sun's being so associated with agriculture. All right, so skip on ahead to ancient Egypt. We'll get to let's get to Ra and
Zagmuk. I'm at Zagmuk.
Yeah.
A feast of Ur.
Yeah.
Okay. Egypt.
Okay.
Ra.
Okay.
Egypt. Ra.
So
Ra sushi.
Yes. Okay. So you see Ra there with his cool head, with his cool bird head, and holding and you see the big red sun over his head. He's the sun god. Ra is pretty famous. I think a lot of people have heard of Ra because they've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, so they know Ra, because he's got the staff of Ra. The sun goes through.
Yes.
But in Egypt, a bit later, Egypt develops a little bit later than Sumeria, and similar stories and celebrations would sort of emerge there. Egyptians celebrated the death and rebirth of Ra for 12 days. Now, again, like if you look at your geography, right, Egypt is Mesopotamia and Egypt are right next to each other, right? I mean, Egypt is in Africa, but it is also just across the Persian Gulf from the Arabian Peninsula, and it is just across the just that thin strip of Mediterranean to the Mesopotamia. To you could navigate really by like canal boat from the Nile across, just by with paddles from the Nile to Mesopotamia, or you could go across, the Red Sea. There you can cross over, around the Red Sea and go up through the Arabian Peninsula up into Mesopotamia. So these are groups of people that were connected, that traded, that knew each other, a lot of interaction in sort of northeastern Egypt and Mesopotamia. And again, Egyptians celebrated the death and rebirth of Ra for this 12-day celebration, which maybe they get this from Zagmuk and Marduk. Maybe they get it just because, again, 12 really matters because there's 12 moon cycles every year. But every year on December 21st or 22nd, Egyptians would start decorating with evergreen palms and bay laurels, which are an evergreen. Again, we think of evergreens, we tend to think of like pine trees and spruces and firs, but like palm trees are evergreens, right? So, I mean, again, Egypt, where evergreens are going to be palms and bay laurels and things like that. And they would fashion them into wreaths and garlands, and even something, if you click on you'll see the next slide, something resembling like a tree to honor Ra, who died and went to the underground, to the underworld.
The hieroglyph from the Tomb of Roy.
From the Tomb of Roy. I know, it's a weird name. So on December 24th or 25th, depending on the year, they would celebrate that Ra was being reborn. And again, having conquered the underworld, reemerging. Roy, as you see, I think it's on there, was a scribe of the pharaoh Horemheb, who and he was buried in the same funerary temple as Horemheb or Horemheb. And this was one of the hieroglyphs that was like on the wall, and you see like they're fashioning this palm frond. It looks almost like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
It's like it's a wild image to see. But they were, this was like a decoration for, of evergreens to celebrate Ra. Anyway,
Yep.
evergreens were important because they were the symbol of rebirth. They're always important because, of course, they survive the winter. They continue to live when all this other stuff dies. And so, I mean, even down here in Florida, most of our deciduous trees all die. It's just our conifers that survive. And so even though we don't get the beautiful autumn colorscape that you guys get, most of our leaves seem to fall off the trees basically when the buds push them off in March, because it doesn't get cold enough to make them all fall. We'll get some leaf falling in fall and winter, as it were, but like most of it, it's like when the new growth comes in, it pushes all the old leaves off. So like our raking season is like February, March, which is awesome. It's like and they fall like boom, all of them come off.
Right at once.
Yeah. There's no there's no beauty involved. It's just like everything it's the same as they sort of die. Like there's no orange, there's no red. It's just sort of like there's kind of a haphazard paint splatter of color, and then everything's just dead. Anyway,
right.
So again, evergreens really important for the Egyptians. All right. So then the next one we're going to talk about is a guy named Mithra. We're going to really come back to Mithra because
let me see this guy.
Okay, well, yeah, you're going to see some images of Mithra slaughtering a bull, and
okay.
Mithra. Like I said, he's more important later than he kind of was. Like we actually have like no ancient sources of Mithra, except for these carvings. We have no like written sources. We just have these.
This guy's a stud. Look at him.
Well, so again,
he looks Greek.
Yeah, so he's Persian. So like, of course, I mean,
close enough.
Exactly. The Mithra was the sun god of like ancient Persians, Assyrians, and whatnot. And he was a sun god, and his birthday was December 25th. And the most important thing about Mithra is that Roman soldiers later on will form a cult around the worship of Mithra. So the myth is that Mithra was a messenger of the sun god, and thus he was connected to the sun as a god himself, right? Like he wasn't necessarily the sun god, but he was like the anthropomorphic representation of the sun god. For the Persians,
there's a lot of symbolism in this picture here.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about it in a second. So Mithra. So while like the Egyptians have Ra, who is basically like this god that carries the sun across the sky, and Marduk is basically the sun god in the same sort of way. The Greeks had Apollo that carried the sun across the sky in a chariot.
Damn right they did.
The Persians with Mithra, the sun god, the sun was itself a god, and Mithra was the sun's messenger. He was the sort of anthropomorphic version that could like interact with humanity in a direct way. So like not the sun god himself, but kind of like the Hermes, that would come down and like communicate with people,
Correct.
Right? The messenger of the god. But as a result, people sort of treated him as a sun god. And more importantly, when Romans later on will find Mithra, they will encounter Mithra as the sun god, right? Not like they didn't sort of have this nuance. Anyway, the story with Mithra is that he was sent to Earth to sacrifice a white bull, but he didn't want to do it because he was like, I don't want to kill this innocent life. I don't want to take this innocent life.
Yeah.
But he did. He followed his orders like he was supposed to, and that's why like the images you see, he's like looking away.
He doesn't look into it.
Yeah, he's looking away. So he kills the bull, and when he does, the bull itself, the white bull, transforms into the moon, and the blood that spurts from the bull's throat will sprout the very first grains that people can then eat, like the first grains of wheat or whatever. And Mithra's cloak that he's wearing basically becomes mounted as the sky and holds the stars and the planets. And then the seed from the bull's testicles becomes the spark of life that exists within all living things.
Love it.
Yeah. So Mithra is again, same thing. He's not just a savior of humanity, but he ultimately is responsible for creating humanity. Now, the sun created humanity by sending him or whatever, but because he did his duty, all like he puts the divine spark in all living things, right? So pretty important
You
dude.
got these. You got the two ravens over here.
Yep.
You got the bull, right? He's not into it. He's killing him. You got the two midgets on the side, and then it looks like the beheaded people here.
The two midgets
around.
on the side would just be like humanity.
Okay, and then the dog.
Yeah, I mean, again, just like because the spark of life, you've got a scorpion as well.
Scorpion. I was just going to say there's a scorpion.
Yeah, and probably a snake at the bottom, unless that's water. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I can't tell.
Yeah, it's hard to know.
You know what?
Yeah.
It's a snake. It's wrapped around. See how it wraps around?
Sure. It's wrapped around the bull's leg. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
All right.
It's a snake.
So okay. So enough of the ancient world. Let's get to the ancient world that we know a little bit better, and talk about Rome. We're going to skip right over the Greeks, but Rome. So for the Romans, their primary winter festival was also centered around the solstice. Excuse me, but it lasted from December 17th to December 23rd. They did not have this 12-day celebration. They had 7 days of Saturnalia. Now, Saturnalia, Saturn
sounds fun.
Saturn, the god Saturn, was the god associated with agriculture. So again, this makes sense given the solstice, right? But the thing about Saturn was, I don't know if you know the mythology, and the Romans stole their mythology straight from the Greeks and just changed the names. But
sure they did.
The Romans, Saturn was believed to have ruled over humanity during a time of perfect justice, and then Jupiter came along and killed him. And Jupiter is sort of like Zeus, and rules over humanity now. But Saturn was sort of Saturn was sort of celebrated as this the god who ruled over humanity during this time of equality and justice, with this perfect understanding of humanity, right? Like for all people. So Saturnalia festivals celebrated these values kind of associated with Saturn's rule. And the thing Romans would say to each other was, when it was Saturnalia, they'd say, "Yo, Saturnalia." That's what the I-O was pronounced. Yo.
Ooh.
Yo, Saturnalia. And I like that because it's, I think it's a tradition we should revisit. Be like, yo.
We'll start saying
yo, Saturnalia. I will in 4 days.
Start saying
so because Saturn was the god of kind of the harvest, again, associated with agriculture, the holiday is celebrated with feasting, right? It was one of the central features of the holiday. And this serves two functions. I mean, obviously, having a celebration in December, it's kind of like you have to thin out some of your herds because they're not necessarily going to survive the winter. So it's a good time to slaughter a bunch of animals because they're going to be a tax on limited resources during the winter. You know what I mean? So it's a good time to feast so that all that slaughter doesn't go to waste, right? Anyway, so this is sort of common. We're going to revisit this in a minute when we get to the Germans, or the Germanics, really. Anyway, the festival included, though, a number of really familiar traditions. It's really important how Saturnalia is celebrated because this is in Rome, which is a pretty important, I mean, not just because they conquer so much of the known world, known to Western people, but because becomes the seat of Christianity and everything else. But the way they celebrated was through gift giving, through drinking and feasting. They would ceremonially drink wine and they would feast. They would engage in a bunch of role reversals. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Each town would choose a king of Saturnalia who, they would choose from the common folk who could basically everything they ordered was the law. So they would do all sorts of things. They would make anyway. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically, but each town would choose this sort of festival king. And one of the most interesting things about Saturnalia was that the Romans, who their whole society was really rigidly based on following a moral, but they considered themselves to be extremely moral people. And that you had to follow a strict, you had to live a strict moral life, according to their morality, or else you could, as far as they were concerned, you'd cause the complete downfall of all humanity.
Yep.
Now their morality was not our morality by any stretch of the imagination, but
sure.
But that's what they believed. But during Saturnalia, and only during Saturnalia, gambling was not just legal, but encouraged during
Nice.
Saturnalia. Yeah.
Oh, great.
So during Saturnalia, everyone had free speech and free movement, even slaves. People would wear gaudy clothes, usually in what they called in the Greek fashion. They would wear these Greek clothes,
Yep.
As opposed to the more formal, tunics and togas.
Sure.
Togas, of course, are like formal wear. It's like wearing a tux
Sure.
around.
Yep.
And they would people would wear what was called the Peleus cap, or a Phrygian cap, which was a red. The Phrygian cap is a sort of a red hat that people would wear. It has a kind of the cap kind of comes up and sort of falls over a little bit.
Yep.
And it was a symbol of freedom. When slaves were freed, they were given this red cap to wear in order to demonstrate that they were free. And they would wear that for a while until sort of everyone in the community recognized that they had earned their freedom or had gained their freedom in some way or another. And then because generally the custom in Rome was to keep your head uncovered. So, but you would wear the freedom cap for some period in order to symbolize your freedom. And then as far as these role reversals were concerned, slaves and servants would often eat these like huge feasts before they ever prepared food for their masters. Women might run the households during Saturnalia and give orders to the men, something completely, out of character for the Romans, who very firmly believed in the whole paterfamilias idea.
Yep.
And servant, slave, and plebs alike could all speak freely, even criticizing their patrons and masters. Although I think, we have to be realistic and imagine that like you had to be a little bit cautious because,
Sure.
you didn't want to express the full extent of your feelings because Saturnalia is only a week.
After
You know
the
what I mean?
week's
Like,
over,
if you're
out in the field.
free
but
speech. Yeah, free speech. But like, I imagine that if you exercise that a little bit too much, it would be hard for the master to forget the things you said. You can chalk it up during Saturnalia, but you're probably going to die after that. Throughout December in Saturnalia, they would have 10 days of gladiatorial games
Oh,
to
wonderful.
be held as a kind of human sacrifice.
Truly
to
wish I could
Saturn.
have gone back to see the gladiators fight. That's one thing I'd like to go back in time to see. Is go to the Colosseum, see some men kill men, see some men kill lions, see some lions kill men. Like I want to see that up close and personal.
The lions thing is a bit exaggerated, but the men killing men. I mean, the thing about all the gladiatorial games is like these are typically war captives or slaves who it's a human sacrifice. I mean, this is intended to be human sacrifice. That's what this. Yeah, I know. I got it, Commodus.
And then boom, baby, you're out.
I get it.
Thumbs
Commodus.
are down. Your thumbs are down. You're out of here.
It's a crazy thing because the gladiators in theory could earn their freedom if they made enough money and stuff like that. But like it happened incredibly rarely. I mean, it's like a very small number over hundreds of years ever.
Maximus did it.
Yes, in the wonderful documentary Gladiator.
I mean, that's as true of a story as you can get from back then.
Not really, but yeah, I mean it's not really true at all.
Caesar.
But that was Commodus. But anyway, yeah. So, but the thing to remember is that like this was human sacrifice. Mm-hmm. It was human sacrifice for to Saturn for a good harvest the next year. So the gladiatorial games were about that.
Correct.
Were about sacrifice, spilling enough blood to make sure that the earth would come back fertile. So the other thing was like they did this gift giving as part of the tradition, but in general, the gifts that were given were more like gag gifts or like small trinkets. And honestly, they had this whole thing where it was like the smaller and more kind of like more mundane and more humorous the gift, the closer the relationship was thought to be. So Caesar Augustus, Octavian, was reportedly like a huge fan of these gag gifts. Like he really, in a lot of ways, like strikes me as Elon Musk, like just the corny, like the corny ass, like just no actual sense of humor, like just like the corniest dad joke dude that you can imagine. Like, oh, I got these really funny gag gifts for all my people. So he was really into it. And like, so of course, since he was into it, everybody else had to be really, really into it. The other thing was that like mobs of like regular working folks, would often get like plebs would get like wildly intoxicated and would go sort of estate to estate demanding tributes of bread from the wealthy and like threatening their lives if they didn't get it. So like,
Nice.
you get this sort of idea of going door to door and like demanding some sort of either bread or wine as payment. In a lot of ways, it sort of sounds a little bit like Halloween, like a trick or treat kind of deal.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the king of Saturnalia was called the Saturnalicius Princeps, or the king, was elected, and his commands had to be obeyed by all who were celebrating, even his social betters. So some of the ones that we know about that like we have records of are like were these like princeps saying things like everybody has to strip naked and sing songs to Saturn, and so like everybody would have to do that. Or he'd like look at a social better who and be like, this guy's like has either wronged me or he makes me mad or whatever, and so he would just like tell the crowd, throw him into the cold water, and they would do it, and like there was no repercussion for doing so. So some towns would elect the king from among criminals. And then they would be like celebrated by all people, and they'd be expected to indulge in every vice that was illegal throughout the year. And they would basically take on the transgressions of the entire community. So like basically you'd get a criminal and you would basically make them commit all of the sins, all of the sins that the community is supposed to, not engage in. And they would have to do it in very public ways, right? So it was literally taking on the sins of the community. So they, it just would be, insanely drunk, engaged in all sorts of sexual immorality, which for the Romans really meant something. And I mean, like, considering the sexual mores of the Romans were very different.
They were all about.
And so, like, if you.
They just loved the gangbang. They loved the group sex. When I think Romans, I think just group gangbang.
The orgy. Yeah, the
orgies and shit like that, man. It's not my thing.
Yeah, and I mean that, and it was pretty typical that like if you were a well-to-do, established man, a senator or something of that sort, you were kind of expected to take on a young boy as a sexual protege. And engage in intercourse with a young boy until his adulthood, and then you would provide him with some sort of position of power or land or something like that. So that was a pretty typical.
From the Greeks. They took that from the Greeks.
Yeah, the Greeks, and I mean it's not uncommon. I mean, King David and Jonathan were probably gay. Gay. Were engaged in homosexuality, at least according to like the earliest rabbis believed so. That's for sure.
The earliest motto for the Greek army was "Never leave your brothers behind."
Yeah, the Trojans. When the Trojans lived in sexually. Sex segregated, primarily a sex segregated society, not the Trojans. The Spartans lived in a gender segregated society, and when the majority of their population were slaves, Helots, but they were significantly outnumbered by Helots. Something like 85% of the population were slaves. Which is part of why like every adult male like trained from the time they were like a child in military service, because they had to control an enslaved population through violence. And anyway, but when Spartans would get married, it was the women, whoever was the bride to be, as it were, would be they would take the bride to be and they would shave her head into the military style of haircut. She would be dressed in men's military attire. She would be taken to the marital chamber, and she would be held down, face down, held down, stripped naked at the waist, held down, and her husband would come in and she would, for all intents and purposes, look just like a soldier. With her, you couldn't see her face. Her hair was cut like a man, and she was dressed like a man, and he would come in and he would, engage in intercourse, and then he would leave her there, and she would be attended by the female attendees who, I assume she probably cried in their arms because that was a horrifying experience. And that was, congratulations, you're married now. And that is like the whole thing with the Spartans. If you are, like the Spartans of the leadership class, would just, it's just like it's a whole thing, man. It's a whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty, very romantic. It's one of the funniest things about 300, in looking at this like very romantic relationship between Pericles and his wife, not Pericles, whatever his name is, I can't think of it, and his wife, and you go, well, that's not how any of this happened. Like, it's the whole other thing. Like, she was required to look like a man and be held down so that there was nothing identifying her as a female, except yeah. She's made to basically in every possible way look like a man, except slightly different. Like not just a man, but like a like a soldier. Yeah.
Yep.
And then they would go back to living their gender isolated lives, segregated lives, and like there's probably a good reason that they did it that way. Anyway, but whatever, different norms, like different. They were just different morals.
Yep.
Anyway, so back to these Saturnalicious princeps. So they would take on all the sins of the community, right? They commit any and every immorality you could imagine, and they'd have to do so publicly. And then at the end of the week, they would be publicly executed for the community, basically dying for their sins. Like they would, taking on the sins of the entire community, be slaughtered, and they would then purify the community, saving them from their sins at the end of the Saturnalia celebration. So that's how you did it. You put all your sins onto the one person, and then you had them die for your sins.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now Saturnalia, the customs would spread into medieval Europe. You probably start switching to the next. I'm sure something come up on Sol Invictus here.
I'm at the Sol Invictus coin. Should I be at the coin
Perfect.
yet?
We're getting. Yep, you're good.
Good.
So a lot of these customs of Saturnalia, the drinking, the feasting, the ruckus making, right, the mobs going door to door and all that, even the idea of like the king of Saturnalia would continue as part of a Christmas celebration throughout the Middle Ages. Once Christianity spreads, like all of these elements of Saturnalia continue. Mm-hmm. The king of Saturnalia would be replaced actually by boys who were elected to be bishop for the day and lord of misrule in England. But they would be the same rules, right, applied. They would, like you'd have some boy who would be elected as the bishop for the day or elected as the lord of misrule. And they would then be able to give whatever orders they wanted to their social betters, to the whole crowd that was celebrating. Bishops and priests would, during the celebration, usually dress as women, and for throughout the celebrations, and the orders that would be handed down as part of this role reversal kind of idea, and the orders that were handed down were usually pretty bawdy, everybody stripped naked and sing, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like that was the idea. It was an opportunity for sort of licentious behavior, and a kind of role reversal, like an inverting of the social norms.
Gotcha.
Unlike other Roman holidays that were localized, Saturnalia was one of the only ones that was celebrated throughout the entire empire. And we know, of course, how far Rome's empire spread. Mm-hmm. Most other Roman holidays were associated with local gods. And so, like they would be celebrated intensely wherever that god was venerated, but not really outside of that area necessarily. Saturnalia was one of the only ones that, that really, it didn't matter where you were. Everyone celebrated.
Yep.
Again, this sort of matters when it comes to Christmas, because of course the Romans took this celebration as far as the empire went. And so you have this hundreds of year old tradition of celebrating every December, this very fun, raucous festival that lasts multiple days. Now, you remember our old friend Mithras, the Persian god?
I do.
Well, okay. The Romans, a number of Roman soldiers, as they went into Iran or Persia, and they learned of this Mithra cult, they sort of learned about this sun god and all this. Roman soldiers really, for whatever reason, adopted this the god Mithras, who they called in Latin Sol Invictus, meaning the invitation of the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And they started including a celebration for Mithras's birthday, December 25th, as part of sort of like tacked on right at the end of Saturnalia, which ended on like the 23rd. So they would just tack it on the end, celebrating Sol Invictus. And so, so they really, they sort of developed this cult of the sun around this. They would use candles to signify the returning power of the sun. They would use hang bows of like evergreens to decorate their camps or their homes for the holiday. And actually, believe it or not, up until about the 4th century, there was a really significant battle for primacy between Christianity and these Sol Invictus cults throughout the Roman Empire. The Sol Invictus cult was huge, and there was the old Roman religion had kind of by the 3rd century had failed to was failing as a social institution. It was failing as a political institution, more importantly. There was too much fractured kind of beliefs. The belief system was too fractured, right? This goes back to this whole thing where every region celebrates its own kind of regional god. So the religion holding the Roman Empire together has ceased to be very effective. And so by the 3rd and then 4th centuries, you have these various religious cults that are sort of jockeying for position within the empire because, again, there is no kind of empire-wide religion. There are gods that everyone venerates, but there's no like ritual calendar holding it all together. But things like Saturnalia and Sol Invictus are celebrated regardless of region, right? If you become part of the Sol Invictus cult, you celebrate this everywhere. And so it has a kind of unifying, impact on the Roman people. And so there is this real battle between Christianity and Sol Invictus. Christianity spreads, at least in part, because it is also a unifying religious idea, something that it doesn't matter what region you're in, everybody can sort of, they're hammering out the rules as they go. And so there's a kind of, there are certainly battles about what Christianity is going to look like between various sects, but also it is a unifying system as opposed to the Roman system, which was a fractured and regionalized one. So again, there's a kind of political rationale for one of these two religions becoming the dominant religion in Rome as we move to like the 4th century after a period of 100 years or so of weak emperors and factions dividing even further. So you get to Sol Invictus, you see that mosaic of Sol Invictus there. So I like that mosaic because this is a thoroughly pagan mosaic. But what's it look like to you?
A dime.
Oh, not the coin, the mosaic, the one made out of tiles.
Oh, how do you go back? Hold on, I gotta go look at that. Oh shit, I'm going forward. The Germans. I don't need the Germans.
Hit escape.
Escape.
And then click on the tile and then go back to play from there. So slideshow play from here.
Let's see. Let me see here. Let's see. Who does that? That looks like the Mona Lisa.
Okay, well, maybe.
Or Mother
but
Teresa.
Like with the rays coming off of his head.
Jeebus.
Every picture of every saint I've ever seen.
Yes.
Like Saint Mark, Saint John, John the Evangelist, he looks like every like gospel writer, Paul, Peter, like he looks like all of the saints the way that they are portrayed in the early era.
Correct.
With the rays coming off of their head. And I think that's kind of interesting because it's not
very they look very feminine or very pretty. The men are very portrayed as very pretty.
Sure. Because that is of aesthetic value.
And the men
to the Romans.
like to bang men, so they wanted them to look pretty all the time. If I had to,
I don't know about it.
If I was banging men, I'd bang the pretty men, right?
Yeah, but this is also this just goes to sort of cultural preference, cultural understanding. Like, Aristotle sort of talked about this to some extent, like how Aristotle viewed the male figure as far more beautiful than the female figure. He saw the female figure as utilitarian and the male figure as the model of perfection in artistic beauty. And I think if you asked most people today, they would say aesthetically, they would say the opposite. I think most people in the West, again, not everywhere, but most people in the West would say that aesthetically women are far more pleasing than men.
Sure.
Which, going back to our crisis of masculinity, doesn't help.
Right.
That is part of that, is in this idea that it is hard. It is hard. The cultural pressure stands against finding men beautiful.
Right. And older women.
And yeah, but yeah, well, okay, you're getting more specific than I mean, just broadly speaking.
I get it. Yep.
Like broadly in the culture, sure, there are pretty men portrayed in public spaces, but by and large, the cultural aesthetic feeling is that women are more object than subject, and men are more subject than object.
Correct.
And I mean, again, and these are just social choices. These are just, obviously from like you said, looking at that mosaic, you see how pretty the men are. And they are, like, most men are portrayed as very pretty.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's not really a better word for it. They're beautiful. And while certainly there are some women portrayed that way, men are pretty consistently portrayed that way. And women are, it's much more mixed bag. Goddesses, perhaps, but regular women, less so.
Right.
Women are portrayed with a more utilitarian look. They look practical. Men look beautiful. Right. And again, that's just like a cultural choice. Anyway, so you go to that gold coin with Emperor Constantine, and Constantine the Great is the sort of famous emperor because he brought Christianity he made Christianity the official religion of Rome.
Gotcha.
Now, the Catholic story about Constantine the Great is that he had a vision before battle of a cross in the sky. So he had all of his men paint a cross on their shields, and then they won this battle. And so then his mother, Helena, converted him. She had been a Christian and she converted him. And so that's the story. And that then he makes Christianity legal. It becomes the religion of the empire. And that really, whatever. Now, it is true. Constantine does make Christianity sort of the official religion of the empire, but also that doesn't mean other religions weren't also still allowed. It does become tied to the empire, which is why the Catholic Church looks so much like, in terms of its governance, so much like Rome. I mean, like it's the hierarchical construction of the Catholic Church is very similar to the Roman Empire's hierarchical construction.
Yes.
Even in terms of the terminology we use, Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest, was the name given to the emperor because the emperor, church and state were intimately tied in Rome. So the emperor was also the head priest.
Yes. And
under the empire. Anyway, what I think is interesting about this is that there's a lot of this whole thing about Constantine converting is kind of an interesting thing because for a guy that converted and then lived a long life, it's weird that he wasn't baptized until literally on his deathbed. And the coins that he had minted after his conversion, like this one, like the two that I show here, depict him merged. Like this one here shows him merged with Sol Invictus as his charioteer on the front, and then being led by the sun on the back. And then the next coin, the gray one, says the verse has an inscription that says, "To the unconquered sun," dedicating Constantine to the sun god. So he's literally dedicating his imperial reign to Sol Invictus, which is a weird thing to imagine. If he really converted, that seems an odd thing to put on your coin, right?
Yeah.
And we know that like the Sol Invictus was extremely popular, of course, among the soldiers, and he had a huge temple to Sol Invictus built in his name as one of his massive public works projects. So like, he didn't really, I don't know how much he converted as much as he was like, it is pragmatically, we need to change the official religion to one of these things. And I think he just saw Christianity as a better opportunity while he continued to practice Sol Invictus. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so as a result, though, when Sol Invictus is on all your coins and it's fine to practice and the emperor is practicing, these ideas will spread. But of course, Christianity becomes the law of the land. And so a lot of people become Christian, but the ideas will merge. So this is the whole, so who cares about all this? Sol Invictus is Mithra, whose birthday is December 25th, which is right at the tail end of Saturnalia when everybody celebrates. So, the holidays kind of merge. Saturnalia and Mithra's birthday become kind of one larger celebration, right? And I think that's kind of important. That's how it kind of socially, what happens is the Saturnalia festival that used to go from the 17th to the 23rd just kind of carries through the 25th as part of this Sol Invictus celebration. And then it will kind of go on from there to we'll see in a bit. Anyway, these Mithraic cults introduced, and this is kind of interesting because, I don't know if you know, but in the book of Matthew, so I'm not doing like an Old Testament thing, the book of Matthew 23:9, Jesus forbids calling a rabbi father, that no teacher should be called father. You should have no one called father who teaches you except your Father in heaven, Jesus says.
Correct.
Now, the Sol Invictus cults, their priests had the rank of father, and father was a rank in Roman society. The paterfamilias, right, was like the head of household, the father of household. So the priests of the Mithraic cult were called father. And of course, Christianity will eventually sort of adopt this idea of calling priests father, a thing that is forbidden by Jesus in the book of Matthew. Also, early Christians celebrated, because they were grown out of Judaism, celebrated the Sabbath on Saturdays, the Sabbath day. And so they celebrated it switched to Sunday because Sunday worship
blue
was
sky laws.
What the myth,
because of the blue sky laws.
Sunday worship was because Sunday was the day of the sun, Sol Invictus, the day that the Mithraic cults, the Sol Invictus cults, had their worship. They worshipped their sun god on Sunday.
Makes sense.
And so the Christian church, because it was still battling with the Mithraic cults for supremacy, began celebrating Christian rites during Mithraic practice. Jesus called his disciples to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But because of the popularity of Sunday worship, worshiping the sun god on Sunday, Christianity becomes sort of bled into these mystical cults. And we continue to carry on these mystical cult practices today that are fundamentally antithetical to the things Jesus allegedly taught in the New Testament. But we've rationalized our way out of it because it happened so long ago that people were like, well, it's just tradition, right?
Correct.
But it happened specifically because people were worshiping the sun gods. They literally used to build all their churches facing east, the direction that the sun rose, so that they could they say their prayers facing east at the sun in the mornings, as opposed to Christian celebrations that used to be on the Sabbath evenings. So again, you start worshiping on Sunday mornings because of the association with the rising sun, instead of Saturday evenings, celebrating the end of the Sabbath day that you've kept holy.
Interesting.
Yeah. The other thing about Mithra and Sol Invictus was that they had incorporated earlier practices that go back, the practices that go back in humanity farther than any of these other gods. The very earliest gods that we know about anywhere of any kind, through any symbols that we have, are mother goddesses. Mother goddesses are ubiquitous. We find them all over the world.
Angelina Jolie's one.
Yes, exactly. We find the mother goddess symbolized everywhere through all of humanity. And you can actually go back to early church fathers like Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen in the 3rd and 4th century, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, who all write about how Christians faced east to pray so they could pray toward the rising sun. Eusebius who lived from 260 to 340, he made clear talking about this, that this was Christians engaging in a pagan practice, like worshiping on Sundays because of the sun. This all began as part of the December Saturnalia and Sol Invictus celebrations. And this was followed historically by worshiping the mother goddess. So you first celebrate that the sun is reborn, and then you would celebrate the mother goddess and her infant son 12 days after the solstice. So 12 days after the solstice, you would celebrate the birth, the mother goddess giving birth to a child, as a symbol of the coming fertility of the world, right? So 12 days after solstice, you celebrate this mother goddess giving birth to an infant son, again, because you're looking forward to being able to plant and have a fertile earth and all this stuff. Christians took this celebration 12 days after the solstice, and they transformed it into the mother goddess being Mary and Jesus being the baby. And the earliest Christians that celebrated Christmas did so on January 6th, 12 days after December 25th. And so they took these mother goddess celebrations and they started changing keeping everything in place, but changing the language from mother goddess to specifically Mary, from infant son to Jesus, and celebrating the birth of Jesus on January 6th.
That was the original Christmas, January 6th?
The earliest celebrations of the Nativity were in Egypt, and Christians were specifically trying to replace ritual celebration of the mother goddess and her infant with Mary and Jesus. So they specifically adopted January 6th as a date in order to try to convert people by basically accommodating their religious practice. So the date was chosen because it was the day that people were already celebrating. And they were like, no, you're right. It is about the mother goddess and the infant. Their names were Mary and Jesus. And so you can actually see in representations, early representations of Mary and Jesus, they look exactly the same as the mother goddess and infant. Like nothing changes. It takes years before anything changes. St. Augustine, sorry, I live in Florida. St. Augustine, who was writing in the 4th century, and I'm sure you know St. Augustine. I mean, he's one of the sort of towering minds of the church. He wrote in the 4th century, in the 300s, urging Christians, please do not celebrate the December holiday because it's sun worship. So he begged Christians not to celebrate the what becomes Christmas because it was a pagan celebration. And so he writes out saying, begging Christians, urging them that they cannot do this because it is a pagan celebration. It's not Christian. Pope St. Leo the Great, writing in the 5th century, 100 years later, tried to rebuke people because they continued this belief that they were celebrating the birth of the new son. They had dropped the word God, but they were celebrating the birth of the son. And he kept trying to rebuke them and say, no, we're celebrating the birth of Jesus. And they were like, no, we're celebrating the birth of the son. So the Pope was wrote letters to all the churches, again, rebuking people, telling them that they can't keep celebrating this way. They have to change. But by then, of course, the cultic practices of worshiping the mother goddess and her infant and the Mithra Sol Invictus, situation, they were already thoroughly entwined into Christian practice, and you could not go back. Meanwhile, you see, I think I've got some images there of the mother goddess.
I see a map. I'm at the map. Let me go.
Does it say Germany?
I got the Germans.
Does it say Die Deutschland?
And now I'm at the Germans. There's
the
picture
Germans.
Of this,
the Germans. Okay.
This character with the sword on the horse.
Yeah, okay. All right. So that's where we're going next. So in the rest of Europe, winter solstice traditions were practiced and refined over time as well, just like everywhere else, right? In Slavic areas, they celebrated variations of what was called Koliada or Korokun. They were celebrated sort of in the December 21st to 23rd, right, around the solstice. These celebrations were, again, centered on the idea that Horus, the old sun god for them, was killed by the black god on the solstice, which was the 22nd, but then resurrected as somebody named Koleda, the new sun, on the 23rd. So they started celebrating on the 21st. On the 22nd, the sun was killed and then was resurrected on the 23rd reborn as Kaleda, the savior of humanity. Celebrants would like take to the outdoors. They'd celebrate with drink and revelry. They'd wear masks and costumes. They'd light crossed logs at crossroads, and they'd sit around bonfires in cemeteries that were lit to keep their ancestors warm during the longest nights of the year. Polaznik, or what was called the first guest, would be a kind of omen for whether the coming year would be a good year or a bad year. So people would drink and celebrate. They'd go door to door and sort of ask for gifts, or like gifts of food, gifts of wine, that sort of thing. So you'd have a bunch of drunken revelers, they'd wander. And then, so whoever the first person to walk into your house would be a kind of omen for the following year. So you always hoped you'd get some sort of like a young, innocent child who would walk in, because that would be a symbol for a good year. If you got some old person walked in first, the first guest, and of course, whoever shows up, they don't know if they're the first guest or not. Like, you just have groups of people who go door to door. For all they know, they're the 12th group to show up, or they're the first group. Who knows? And so if an old person was the first one to come in, it portended death, disease, sickness for the year to come. So that was, so a lot of value was placed on the first guest. This is a celebration that still exists in Europe, the idea of the first guest. So for the Germans in Northern Europe, Teutonic and Celtic groups developed traditions like Yuletide celebrations. So the idea of Yule comes from the Germanic peoples. You also have kind of Germanic mythologies, best preserved as Norse myth, coming together at this time. So remember that the farther north, the shorter the days in the winter, right? Parts of Scandinavia don't even see the sun rise for like a month or longer. The closer you get to the Arctic Circle, the more likely you are to have, significant chunks of time with no sunlight, no sunrise, right? So bonfires and fire magic became kind of imbued with bonfires and fire become imbued with a kind of magic that was essential for surviving the winter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way that it's not, where the sun is, still available. It's just short. For the Germans, again, evergreens are these powerful symbols of life and fertility during the desolation and death of winter. Obviously, again, you look around and everything is dead, but the evergreens are alive. That is a symbol of fertility. It's a symbol of life, right? So suffice to say that like firs, pines, spruces, and hollies were given a kind of special significance in Northern Europe. Most prominent were the celebrations of Yuletide and what's called Mondrinacht among Anglo-Saxons. Yuletide among most Germans, Mondrinacht among Anglo-Saxons. Mondrinacht, translated into Mother's Night, was held on the evening of December 24th and was represented by a triad of women. Remember, this is all pre-Christianity. So you had a trio of women that represented, they were three women all together as one, representing Mother's Night on December 24th. Yule probably comes from Yolnir, which was one of the Norse god Woden, or Odin's names. Woden. I like Woden rather than Odin, because Woden is where we get the word Wednesday, because it was Woden's day. Woden's day. Like Thursday is Thor's day. Friday is Freya's day. Saturday is Saturn's day. Sunday is Sun's day. Monday is Moon's day. Tuesday is Twee's day, which is another Norse god. So all of our days are named after Norse or Roman gods.
Very interesting.
Or Sol Invictus. So one of the elements of the solstice celebrations for Germanic people was Woden, the father god, right? He would engage during the solstice in something called the wild hunt. He would ride out from Asgard, right, the land of the gods, out into Midgard, which was the land of humanity. And he would ride out his 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, and he would ride at the head of the hunt to observe the behavior of humans, whether they're being good or bad or whatever. He would fly out, and he had 2 black ravens that would fly ahead and listen at chimneys to hear which people were being good or bad. The ravens would report back to Woden, and then he would reward or punish people accordingly. Children would leave hay or carrots or other sort of vegetables out in their shoes for Sleipnir to eat on the night of the wild hunt. So they would leave out little gifts for the horse. And Woden would often leave gifts in their shoes, usually little small coins or fruit, or maybe a little sweet treat, something like that. After so Sleipnir would eat the hay or the carrots, and Woden would leave them a small gift, assuming they'd been good.
Yes.
Where all this is connecting,
sure, of
right?
course.
Yeah. So you got some images there of the wild hunt. I've got a black and white woodcut for you with Sleipnir's 8 legs.
I like it.
And the symbolism of 8 is
that. That's a great picture.
Here.
It's a great portrait. The wild hunt.
Yeah. That's right. I think I gave you a
yes,
painting
that's
as
a
well.
great painting.
The woodcut is very, very old. The painting is like 18th century. Okay, so on to Christmas. All right, now we've done got all our background done. Let's get to Christmas. The Nativity of Jesus, was never celebrated or even really mentioned before the year like 130.
Okay.
There's no records of anybody talking about it.
Okay.
Paul doesn't talk about it. That's an interesting thing. Paul, who the epistles from Paul are the earliest New Testament books that we have. Like they were written earlier than anything else was. And he never really talks about Jesus's birth, never once in any of Paul's letters. Never mentions a virgin birth. None of that stuff ever appears in Paul's letters, which seems like kind of an interesting thing. If it was that important, right? You'd think he would have written about it.
Sure.
He did not.
Nothing.
Or at least we don't have, if he wrote it, we don't have those letters, but one would think they would have appeared more than one, in one letter. Anyway, in fact, it wasn't until the year 335 that the Nativity of Jesus was even acknowledged on Christian calendars. But even then, there was no celebration, no feast day. It was just like mentioned as the Nativity. So it was not a thing that we celebrated for the first 300 years of Christianity. Probably because everybody was celebrating Saturnalia.
Sure.
The day that was celebrated, as I mentioned before, was January 6th. Now, in Egypt, they celebrated the Nativity. Egyptian Christians first started celebrating the Nativity on January 6th. But again, there was a very specific attempt to co-opt what was already something that already existed.
Right.
But the day that was celebrated among other Christians, particularly in Syria, which is kind of the heart of Christianity, it will eventually be Rome, but early on, it's in Syria is really where Christianity takes root, sort of most importantly. And January 6th was celebrated as the day of Jesus's baptism. That's what they celebrated that day.
That's when John the Baptist baptized him.
Correct. That's not actually how the church celebrates it today. That was the day celebrated at early on. 12 days, again, this is 12 days after December 25th. Again, the 12 days of Christmas, right, is from the 25th to January 6th. That's what that is. Mm-hmm. It's from the Nativity to the Epiphany. But there wasn't the Epiphany yet. It was the baptism. As Christians went out with the Roman Empire, once the Western Empire collapses and becomes centered in the East, Christianity actually spreads through the West in part because the Roman Empire falls. So you have all of these barbarians coming in, as it were. It's a terrible way to say it, but you have Visigoths and Goths and all of these groups that come in and sack Rome and they take these elements out. And a lot of Romans sort of spread out from Rome up into Western Europe, and they take some of these ideas with them out into the pagan world. Up into the pagan, into pagan Europe. So as Christians encounter these various pagan traditions in Europe, they basically adopt pagan holidays and just add certain Christian elements. They just try to change the language a bit. They start adding them as feast days in order to keep celebrating the same thing, but they slap on a Christian saint or something like that to make it a feast day. Pagan rituals and practices just become Christian rituals and practices. Various regional cultic beliefs become cults of various saints. So you have all these different cults that exist, and the Christian church just says no, this is a saint.
There's now.
And so you can continue worship. You can continue to you can continue to venerate this particular God that you've venerated all this time, but now we're going to call him Saint Stephen. And so that's basically how that works. Cults of womanhood, motherhood, or fertility that existed everywhere, they all become co-opted as cults of Mary. And again, when I use the word cult, I'm not being, there's no negative connotation there. Like the Catholic Church has, like there is a cult of Mary that is part of the Catholic Church.
Sure.
Like that is what they call it, the cult of Mary. They call it the cult of different saints, the cult of St. Francis, the cult of St. Anthony. All of these things are cults that are sanctioned by the church. So I know when we think of cults, we tend to think of like Jim Jones, but like understand that for the Catholic Church, cultic practice is completely sanctioned so long as it falls within the confines of sort of dogmatic belief. Anyway, so with these cults of womanhood and motherhood comes a kind of new interest in the conception of the birth and conception and birth of Jesus, right? So like as Christians encounter these mother goddess cults, they're like, oh no, we're going to make this a cult about Mary. And then they start really thinking like, we should probably think more about like, and celebrate the conception of Jesus, right? Because all of these pagan cults have practices where they celebrate the conception of various gods, or they celebrate, the mother goddess through like elements of her pregnancies and things like that. So Christmas was kind of invented as a syncretic celebration that brought all of these old traditions together, just like the Romans and the Egyptians had done with Mesopotamian and like Persian practices before them. Christians do the same thing. They take all of these beliefs and these practices and rituals, and they're just like, they just slap a cross on it. So the evolution of the holiday has never, ever really stopped, right? It has changed over time constantly, and it continues to. It's always been a syncretic celebration. Syncretic meaning, blending other elements, right? Like blending these different cultural elements and, discarding some and keeping others, and discarding some here and keeping some others, adding new ones and all this. And incorporates elements from whatever the surrounding dominant culture is. So we're going to look at some of the symbols and sort of root them a little bit historically, but also, just have a little fun with it. You should have a symbols slide there. You should be able to go to symbols next.
Let's see. I'm passing. Hey, ladies. Cult of Mother Goddess. Cult of Mother Goddess.
Yep, that's what I just talked about. So the next picture you should see are
reefs.
There you go. So
I'm at the reefs.
Okay, so the circle as a decoration is ancient, right? Perfect circles are a bit of an anomaly. Like nothing exists as a perfect circle. It is, it is a mystical symbol because it is something that we can't actually reproduce. And so, we come really close, we can get something that looks to the naked eye like a perfect circle, but there is a mysticism to the circle. Even as mathematics evolves and you go, in order to like determine the circumference or, the circumference of a circle, you have to invent an infinite number in pi. So you can only ever, you can only ever estimate the circumference of a circle. You can never actually precisely calculate it because you can't, because pi is infinite. And so you can never really like fully so there's something magical about a circle in that it doesn't really defy the laws of mathematics, but it is unsolvable. Right?
Right.
You can solve it well enough, but you can't solve it precisely the way you can any other shape. And so circles are really important. They, as a decoration, they're ancient. They represent the sun because it is obviously you look up, you see the sun. The moon is a circle, but it's also a crescent and it's also a semicircle and, whatever. But the sun is a circle. You know what I mean? And so it also, because it's it's a line that never ends, represents the cyclical nature of birth, life, death.
Correct.
Excuse me. Now, Scandinavian, like Germanic people, Norse people, used to light a huge evergreen wreath on fire during the solstice during Yule. It would like roll it down a hill, trying to entice the sun to return. Like that was part of their celebration, because they would make this massive wreath and light it on fire and roll it to try and call the sun back.
Nice.
Other Germanic, it's great. Other German peoples would hang wreaths on doors with different herbs would keep different bad spirits away, or certain herbs were thought to entice good harvest. And again, I would say I don't think that we do anything all that different, because you see today people will make wreaths and they'll stick a cinnamon stick in it, or they'll maybe put some cloves, put an orange with some cloves, or an apple with some cloves. I mean, it's the same practice, right? Putting in some good smelling stuff to try it. They might not be thinking about it as warding away bad spirits, but the practice remains.
Correct.
You go to the next page, you'll see Yule logs.
Yep.
Yule logs, today, it's funny, the Yule log is just sort of seen like, oh, you just throw a log on the fire. No. The Yule log was kind of like what you see here. It was a tree. It was a tree that had been denuded of its branches, but it was intended to burn for 12 days.
It was like today's, Everlast log, the one that you buy at the store, the Duralog or whatever they call it.
Yeah, if that lasted for 12 days, correct.
But it lasted for 3 hours, but it's still pretty good.
Right. Yeah, these things were expected to burn nonstop for 12 days. Now, keep in mind, one thing that I think we always forget about, I used to love talking in class about, when you talk about tobacco cultivation, and I'm like, the reason that there were no cigarettes until the 20th century, I mean, people might roll their own, but there were no commercial cigarettes or whatever, is because until the 20th century, there were no lighters or even matches.
It's true.
So so smoking tobacco was something that had to be done ritually, because it had to be done when there was a fire source. It wasn't like you could just light a smoke out on the range. Nobody's going to grab a stick and or a stone and some flint and some kindling in order to light a fire just so they can smoke a pipe or light a cigarette or something. You know what I mean? It was something that was done ritually, because of course it was. You couldn't carry fire in your pocket. So the Yule log burning for 12 days, again, kind of makes more sense when you go back to this time period where the logs were really important for surviving the winter, for as a heat source and as a cooking source. But the Yule log specifically, to have this thing that was the Nordic people, Germans would carve runes into the side of the Yule log, and they were essentially intended to be prayers, and they would sort of be burned up to the gods. They would sort of go up in smoke to the gods. But this thing was intended to just burn nonstop. And then they would preserve a small part of the log to use to light the Yule log for the next year, which again, I think is kind of something that we can kind of see some echoes of today, especially in the Catholic Church, where, you do things like you have the everlasting flame in the church. And so if you, when you make a first confession, or you have a first communion, or whatever, or even Advent or whatever, you light the candles from the everlasting flame. And the idea is that that flame is constantly when that candle burns down, you light the new candle off the old, so that the flame has never died, right? That's the idea.
I have that candle. I have one of those.
So there you go. Yeah, I mean, so that's the idea. The Yule log kind of feels really reminiscent of that. Or the other way around, the idea of saving a piece of the charred log from last year to burn next year's log feels real. Or, I mean, it feels like that. It also feels a bit like taking palm fronds from Palm Sunday and turning them in so they can be burned and turned into ash for Ash Wednesday, right? So, you know what I mean? It feels like it's a real, there's something there. There's something about that in a kind of human psyche, that this continuity, the immortality of it is important.
Correct.
All right. So one of the other symbols, we'll go to the next page. The next slide is Christmas trees, obviously. Now, the story goes that Martin Luther of Protestant Reformation fame,
Martin Luther the King,
not the king, the Protestant Reformation guy,
gotcha.
Was credited with inventing the Christmas tree as we know it. Now, the story goes that he was he had been composing a sermon, and then after he's composing a sermon, he walks home one night, and the stars in the sky glistening off the pine, the evergreen trees, was so beautiful that it moved him to tears. And so he came home and he wired candles to the branches of a tree and lit them on fire in order to recreate the brilliance of the stars twinkling upon the trees, for his family. Now, understand, candles were insanely expensive, right? Now Martin Luther was very wealthy, so he could afford them. But candles were again, the Yankee, everything was a Yankee Candle and up. You know what I mean?
Right.
Now, Martin Luther was also a pretty notorious drinker, pretty heavy drinker. So it's entirely possible, if there is truth to this story, that what he saw was not the brilliance of the stars shining off the trees as much as, when you get drunk eyes and you see the stars, or like if you've been in a swimming pool all day and you see the stars, it's the same kind of thing.
Yep.
I suspect if there's any truth to the story, it probably relates more to that than just he decided to wire some candles to a tree. That said, too, I don't really like the idea of this being like, it seems so highly unlikely that this could be attributed to like one man who is already so insanely famous and well known, like significant a man of history. It seems more like this is the kind of thing, it feels like a folk practice. It feels like something that just evolved naturally. And maybe Martin Luther popularized it. Like that I buy. Like, being a famous dude that everybody read. Because he was like, Martin Luther would have been awesome on Twitter. Like, dude knew how to write in a way that like connected to regular people. And it's part of how the Reformation spread, was that like he would basically battle these other theologians, but like they all wrote like theologians to like the most boring ass, highly educated, losers. And Martin Luther was basically writing to the people and like, to the middle class, but regular people and regular middle class folks and or bourgeois, like proto bourgeois, and like he was like the guy you couldn't wait to see his tweets, man. Like you couldn't wait, and it had to be that way because his message spread because of the printing press. But it was like super expensive to print anything. So no printer would like print this dude's pamphlets unless they thought that there was a good chance they would sell enough of them to make the cost worthwhile. But he was just such a good writer that like, I mean, he really was. I mean, he was just like really was able to like connect to regular people. So he was able to get his message out, and then like people would respond to him, and it was like, I don't want to read this boring ass like point by point takedown. It's just dumb. Like Martin Luther is fun and funny and interesting and like, and snappy and like, man, like he like takes it to his enemies in a way that is like, that's like relatable. And you're just like, yeah, he's very much like the dopamine rush that you get from watching some, well, he is the equivalent of like the dopamine rush that a normal person should get from watching a billionaire get booed on stage awkwardly for 4 minutes, like just not knowing what to do because it's just like I have nothing to say. I'm just free speech warrior with no thought about what to say. And so it's the same thing. Like he's the same kind of. Anyway, so I suspect that this was just like a folk tradition that he, living in Germany, was like, oh yeah, this is a thing that people do, and like just sort of popularized it because his reach was so broad. You know what I mean? But I don't know. All right, next slide is mistletoe. So mistletoe. I don't know how much you know about mistletoe. I've got a couple cool pictures of mistletoe. I like the one with the big balls of mistletoe on the dead tree. So,
yeah, that's different.
Yeah. Now,
mistletoe, smoochy under the mistletoe.
Now, mistletoe is pretty interesting because mistletoe is a parasite.
Okay.
Because it's a parasite, it has a tremendous amount of magical, spiritual significance in Northern Europe in the pre-Christian days. What it does is it latches onto a dead tree and it sticks its roots into the circulatory system of that tree and extracts nutrients using the circulatory system of the dormant tree, right? I mean, we know like trees don't actually die during the winter. They go dormant. But the mistletoe actually is able to like use their circulatory system to extract water from the soil, extract nutrients from the soil, and of course, gather sun. So, it's a perfect parasite. But it appears as like to ancient people, not really understanding the ins and outs of it, this appears to be a thing that is alive, surrounded by death. I mean, it appears to live to live, even though the whole tree is dead, it survives. So that makes it a real powerful symbol of fertility, as you might imagine. For a lot of Germanic people, they believed that the mistletoe actually kept the oaks alive during the winter. And again, it seems like a pretty rational belief. Like the oaks come back and you see mistletoe growing all over it. And it's like, oh yeah, like the mistletoe managed to keep it alive. Now, ancient Greeks used to perform marriages under mistletoe. And in Roman times, when they made peace, they would make peace under mistletoe. Mistletoe being used in fertility rites goes back at least as far as the Aryans in India in like 1000 BC. So I bet you didn't know. Did you know the Aryans are from India?
No.
Yeah, it's a weird thing about Hitler, like idolizing the Aryan race, because they go back. They are Central Asian steppe people who, like from the Central Asian steppes, who went in and sort of conquered around the Indus Valley somewhere around 1500 BC.
Huh.
And but in order to believe that they were the master race, and as a result, they sort of are like the Proto-Indo-European group. I mean, like whatever you call it, biological group. Indo-Europeans sort of come from the merging of Aryans and Indians, and like Aryan people then move back into Europe and encounter all other people and so on and so forth. But it's really interesting because like the mythology of the Aryans for the Germans, they had to believe that they didn't come from the steppes of Asia, that they in fact came from Europe, from east of the Caucasus, west of the Caucasus Mountains, and crossed over, and that's how they got there. So they like had to like create this whole mythology about them not being Asian, but actually being European, and then going to Asia and conquering, and then going to India, in order for Aryans to be like the pure master race from Europe, which is fascinating.
It is.
Anyway, yeah, there's a whole weird culture in India about Hitler too. Like there are stores and brands called like Hitler, and they use swastikas all over the place.
Interesting.
No problem. Yeah, but none of them do it like as Nazis. They admire. There's a whole different cultural relationship to it.
Sure.
And the swastika is like an ancient Hindu. Well, it's an ancient symbol throughout the ancient world. But they've used it. They've used it as an Aryan symbol, like the Aryan, since the Aryans. It's been a symbol for the sun. And while the rest of the world was like, oh, we should probably not use swastikas anymore. In India, they're like, yeah, we're fine. We're just going to keep using the swastika. I think they have it turned the other way around. But still, it doesn't. When you've got a reverse swastika in a store called Hitler's, it's still a little weird. Anyway, yeah, there's a weird thing there. Anyway, all right. So, one more thing about mistletoe in Norse mythology, I've got a picture of a white-berried mistletoe and a rare red-berried mistletoe. In Norse mythology, the god of the sun, Balder, was god of the sun and the harvest, and was immortal. He was impervious to all things. He was the son of Woden. But the only thing that he wasn't impervious to was mistletoe, because of course mistletoe can live when surrounded by death, which makes it very magical, the sort of thing that could kill a god.
Interesting.
Well, in the stories, Loki tricked a blind god named Hoder to hurl a mistletoe spear or fire an arrow, depending on which story you read. And it hits Balder and he dies. And of course, Hoder did not realize that he was going to kill Balder. He didn't know he had mistletoe, blah, blah, blah. Balder was the son of Woden and Frigg. And Frigg, his mother, cried so bitterly for her lost son that her tears fell upon holly trees and turned their berries from white to red. But in other stories, it fell upon mistletoe trees, fell on mistletoe and created, and her tears hardened and turned into the white berries. And in yet other stories, they merged the two, and like mistletoe had white berries and her tear turned them red, depending on where you are and what the common, whether you have holly or white or red mistletoe, that's how the story goes.
That freaking guy.
Okay. So in Yuletide celebrations, there were two animals in particular that were very important. Three, bears are pretty important depending on where you go, but we're not going to talk about bears. The most important that kind of go everywhere in Yuletide are boars and goats.
That's right.
Yes. So Yule goats and Yule boars were these really important animals. Winter festivals were a time of feasting. because herds, again, I told you this earlier, herds have to be thinned because of the coming winter. They dry a lot of food to get through winter, but they also need to eat a lot of food in order to, not waste it.
Correct.
So what develops are these traditions of these huge feasts for friends and neighbors around Yuletide. This happens, again, in the Germanic cultures.
Yep.
The Yule boar would be the culminating meal of the Yuletide celebration, and Christmas ham is the echo of this tradition, right? Because eating a pig at the culminating meal becomes sort of translated into eating a ham at Christmas time. Now, bundled twigs were dipped in the blood of the sacrifice boar because it was seen as a religious sacrifice. Yep. These things are all religion. And they would sprinkle the blood on the statues of the gods in order to solidify oaths that would be sworn by attendees at Christmas time. I mean, at Yuletide, you'd swear oaths to the gods, and then you would sprinkle the blood of the boar on these statues with these bundles of twigs. And I know you've been in church enough to have them to redo your baptism with a bundle of twigs that they dip in the water and use to sprinkle everybody with the baptismal font water.
Yes.
That comes from this tradition.
Gotcha.
Here, Dutch children. Actually, I'm skipping a step. So this tradition in the Norse communities of killing a pig at Yuletide for the culminating meal later on sort of translates a bit until you have the children who would help hunt the boar, and they would chase the boar. They would chase it down, and then the parents would usually strike the final blow. But the kids would sort of
drink its blood.
Not unlike a bullfight, they would throw rocks at it. They would chase it. They would chase it to where it could be killed by the adults. And they would pester it along the way,
sure,
throwing rocks and maybe small spears and things like that, as they essentially were practicing for the hunt later on. But well, as this goes into Dutch, I don't know if you know, but Dutch is a corruption of the word Deutsch, which is a corruption of the sort of German homeland. So the Dutch are basically Germanic peoples that have evolved sort of their own language that is very closely related to German dialects. But it has Scandinavian overtones from a combination of those two groups, sort of in the Netherlands, and then other groups that were involved there, French as well. But anyway, Dutch and Deutsch are related words. And in the Netherlands, the Dutch children would later on, instead of hunting pigs, it becomes a tradition that they would have to raise money at school in order to, all year round, they would save money in order to buy a Christmas pig. So that's what they would do. They would ask, they would do little chores and ask friends and neighbors for, a few coins here and there. And they would collectively raise money in order to buy a Christmas pig for their family. And this idea eventually became sort of changed a little bit slightly as children instead started keeping all their money that they raised for the Christmas pig in a box. And then later in a piggy bank.
Ooh, there you go.
Yeah.
I like
good stuff, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I ended up in some rabbit holes here because it's amazing how this one kind of celebration becomes has all these cultural meanings that all get dragged into a modern understanding. And I'm sorry we have to start so far back, but I think it all builds.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So small goats that were made of straw or and larger goats that were were traditional as part of the celebration. And in a lot of groups, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Egyptians, they used to make a big deal out of what was called the last harvest. Even the Israelites did this. Hebrews did this. When they would complete their harvest, the last thing that got harvested, the last thrashing of the wheat or whatever else, would be used as an offering to the gods. So you harvest everything for the community, for the Lord, for whoever, but the last little bit went to the gods or to God or whatever. And so something from this idea of last harvest, sort of, it seems like this kind of evolves into this idea of turning making these small little goats, right, out of hay or straw. And in Norse communities, the goats are symbolic because the Thor carries Thor's chariot goes across the sky when he carries thunder across the sky. And his chariot is pulled by two goats. And so it's symbolic. The goat is symbolic both because of you're celebrating Thor, god of thunder, going across the sky. But then it does seem to be related to this idea of like the last harvest being spiritually significant. So you take the last harvest and you fashion it into these huge communal goats or these small little goats that you see, like the one you see on that tree there. It's entirely possible this is also related to some sort of fertility rituals, like associated with Pan. A lot of fertility rituals go back to Pan and Dionysus or Bacchus. And one of the pieces of evidence that we have for this is that, like, during Yuletide, it was and continues to be common for men to dress as goats to be part of the kind of door-to-door celebrations that take place.
Interesting.
And you're going to see when we look at some of the other figures associated with Christmas and the celebrations that people will dress up as. There's a real goat-like energy to these other creatures. So there seems to be a kind of universal, something universal about this, which is why I include the goats, because it feels a little foreign to us today in America, but through Europe, there's still there seem to be echoes of this throughout Europe. Okay. Next, we have, of course, reindeer, very symbolic.
Yep. That's a deadly reindeer right there. You see the blood on the antlers. Just got done.
That's because it's velvet. Velvet has fallen off. I like that picture because it looks like he's a bloody beast, but it's really just the velvet falling off of his antlers, and so means he's about ready to rut. So we're going to come back to reindeer a little bit later, but reindeer are really important in Scandinavian regions. They're actually domesticated by Nordic peoples and indigenous peoples in these areas. Peoples that are not associated with Germanic tribes, but people, indigenous communities that live up closer to the Arctic Circle. They domesticated reindeer and really rely on them for milk and food. Anyway, here's an interesting thing: female reindeer in Norse communities would be slaughtered, and their fat would be rubbed on door frames to keep bad spirits away through winter. But female reindeer in particular were thought to have sort of special powers because female antlers grow antlers, unlike most other sort of deer species. They grow antlers, and unlike the males who drop their antlers around November, females keep their antlers all winter long until they give birth around April or May. So one of the funny things about the Santa Claus stuff with his reindeer is that whenever you see them depicted, they always have antlers, but that means they're all female. Because only female have antlers in December. All right. So we're going to come back to reindeer in a minute. But then I want to just move on to a couple little tidbits like gingerbras. That's the French word. Early gingerbreads go all the way back to 2400 BC in like ancient Greece and Egypt, but not quite like what we think of today. But using ginger in breads, real similar product. Crusaders in the 11th century, it was the first time that Europeans encountered ginger, and so they brought this ginger and other spices back to Europe, and basically said, "Hey, everybody, let's experiment with these new spices. What can we make?" So for gingerbras, the earliest ones called for breadcrumbs to be boiled in honey and ginger and other spices. And then you would make these and then, once if they had sugar, they would then start adding some sugar instead of honey, but usually it was honey for sweetening. Anyway, in the 1600s, the very first Lebkuchen recipes were created in Nuremberg, Germany, which is the very first thing that we can relate to like modern gingerbread, like a cookie. And the Germans also introduced the idea of Christmas cookies in traditions of a word that I will not even begin to pronounce. Weihnachtsblattchen.
Far from Pugen.
But more to our point, the Dutch called these winter baked goods koekje.
Cookies.
And the German-Dutch immigrants who came to Pennsylvania brought these words with them, along with the tradition of making these baked goods called koekje. And of course, the English heard that and went, "Oh, cookies," which is why in the United States, we call them cookies, but in the UK, they are called biscuits. because we get our word from the Dutch, and the English have their word from whatever they got their word from. So in England, cookies are called biscuits. Yep.
Biscuits.
So, yep, all because of the Dutch cooked you. All right. So that's where we're going to leave off part 1. Here, we've built all the way up. In part 2, we're going to talk about the St. Nicholas to Santa Claus pipe and the Klaus.
The Klaus.
So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in it for now. Thanks for listening.
Put a pin.